The goal of this video lecture is to review the symptoms of mania and hypomania and the diagnostic criteria for the two mood episodes. Bipolar disorders are characterized by disturbances in mood that involve elevated mood. So in contrast to depressive disorders, where we saw mood states that were low relative to a euthymic mood state, in bipolar disorders, which are characterized by episodes of mania or hypomania, mood might be characterized by a euphoric mood state, an expansive mood state, or we might also see an irritable mood state. And we are also going to see related symptoms. So when we're thinking about mood, we're thinking about not only subjective emotional or affective experiences, we're also thinking about related behavioral experiences, cognitive patterns of thinking, and somatic changes. So the key symptom for both manic and hypomanic episodes is that the mood symptoms must be present. And the mood state that characterizes manic and hypomanic episodes is a distinct period of abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood, also accompanied by abnormally and persistently increased activity or energy. So remember that mood states exist on a spectrum. Elevated mood states are normal, so are depressed mood states. But when we see a very highly elevated mood state, so extremely high relative to a euthymic mood state, and when that abnormally high mood state persists over a period of time, that is characteristic of mania or hypomania. So we're seeing a noticeably elevated mood state. And we also want to be careful to compare this to an individual's baseline level of mood. So whatever euthymic is for that individual, we are noticing a really characteristic shift from their typical mood state. And this mood symptom is necessary for a diagnosis of a manic or a hypomanic episode. In addition to that characteristic elevated mood, we might also see behavioral symptoms, so changes in behavior that are characteristic of this elevated, expansive mood. One behavioral symptom that we might see is changes in speech. And this is characterized by what can either be characterized as pressured speech. So pressured speech is difficult to interrupt, it's very rapid, can seem kind of like it's being driven by a motor. You might also see increased talkativeness. And again, we're going to compare this to an individual's baseline. So we know that different individuals vary in how much they talk, they vary in how quickly they talk. Anybody who's comparing my normal level of speech and my rate of speech to somebody maybe from Missouri or Louisiana who speaks a little bit more slowly, is a little bit more relaxed, is going to notice that my normal pace of speech and my normal volume of speech can be very different from somebody with a slower approach to speaking. So when we're evaluating these behavioral symptoms, we always want to compare this to an individual's baseline. So if an individual begins speaking really rapidly and it's hard to interrupt and they're talking a lot, and it's not really normal for them, that would be indicative of potentially pressured speech. Increased talkativeness, so talking a lot more, being difficult to interrupt, talking for longer periods of time, can also be signs that an individual is having changes in their speech. Another behavioral symptom we might see is an increase in goal-directed behavior. So this might mean taking on new projects at work or at school, starting a new business, deciding to pursue a new degree. It might be becoming more social, so going out a lot more frequently, staying out a lot later, developing a lot of new friendships, or it might be increases in sexual behavior, so engaging in many more sexual experiences than is normal for a person's baseline, having more sexual partners than was previously normal for a person, spending more time pursuing sex than is typical for a person. So again, all of these are going to be evaluated relative to an individual's baseline. So if you see an individual who suddenly has a very noticeable increase in the kinds of behaviors that they are getting involved in, suddenly they're making a lot of big plans. Maybe they're making plans across a lot of domains. So they decide they want to move to a new city, they want to change careers, get a new job, start a new degree, and they've also started new relationships with several romantic partners simultaneously. That would be a very noticeable increase in goal-directed behavior for that person. We might also see this in terms of physical activity. So you might see a lot of psychomotor agitation, similar to what we discussed with the depressive disorders. So you might see a lot of physical activity, undirected, maybe what you might call nervous energy. So pacing or fidgeting, a lot of physical movement. So both of those would be another behavioral symptom of mania or hypomania. And then our last behavioral symptom is what the DSM very diplomatically calls excessive involvement in activities that have a high potential for painful consequences. So this is suggesting that an individual is engaging in behaviors that are potentially negative or harmful. So that might include buying sprees, so spending more money than is characteristic for an individual. They might be running up credit card debt. They might be using substances in a way that's not typical for them, so increasing their drinking behavior or their substance use to a point that they're putting themselves at risk. They might be driving or going to work under the influence. They might be engaging in sexual behavior that's uncharacteristic for them, that's putting them at potential for risk. So for example, meeting new partners in unsafe ways, engaging in sexual activities that have the potential to be physically harmful in ways that are not characteristic for an individual. So engaging in activities that might have potentially harmful consequences and not potentially considering the risks of those behaviors. So this set of symptoms capture the behavioral symptoms that might accompany that elevated mood state in a manic or a hypomanic episode. Our next set of symptoms are the cognitive symptoms. So these are changes to thought patterns that are characteristic of this elevated mood state. So one characteristic symptom we might see is inflated self-esteem or grandiosity. So just like with the depressive disorders, we had a tendency to see diminished self-esteem and a low sense of self-worth. During a manic or a hypomanic episode, we could see the opposite. So we could see people whose self-concept becomes very high, perhaps to the point that they may even experience delusions of grandeur. So they may believe that they have special powers, or they might start to believe that they have been given a special mission, that they are the reincarnation of the Messiah or Cleopatra. So this can exist on a spectrum. So sometimes when I'm assessing this, I'll ask people, I'll say, how have you been feeling about yourself lately? And someone with inflated self-esteem might say, I feel fantastic. I've never been this great. I'm just doing so much better than everyone else. I just don't understand how the rest of the world functions because I am completely on top of my game. So an individual whose sense of self and self-worth is expansive, is elevated compared to their typical baseline, this inflated self-esteem we might see as indicative of a shift in their cognition. Another very characteristic cognitive symptom is what's described as either racing thoughts or a flight of ideas. So with the behavioral symptoms, we had a behavioral manifestation of this with that pressured speech or that increased talkativeness. This cognitive symptom is a subjective experience that a person's thoughts are going very rapidly or going from topic to topic very quickly in a way that's difficult to follow. So a person might describe this subjectively. They might say, I can't follow my own train of thought. I'm having all of these thoughts go through my head. They might have ideas that jump from topic to topic very quickly that are difficult to follow. So you might notice that in their speech, they become a little bit tangential or are jumping from thought to thought very, very quickly. Sometimes an individual will have insight into this. They'll be able to describe it and say that they feel like their ideas are becoming difficult to follow. Other times an individual may not have insight into their racing thoughts and the fact that their thought pattern is so speeded up. So you might be looking for more objective indicators of this, like looking at patterns in their speech. And then our final cognitive symptom is distractibility, and this can either be subjectively reported by the individual or can be observed. And this is another symptom that we also saw with our depressive disorder. So remember that difficulty concentrating and sustaining attention was a symptom of a depressive episode, but we can also see difficulty sustaining attention in manic and hypomanic episodes. So this distractibility is often characterized by being easily distracted by new ideas. So finding your attention very easily captured by novel stimuli. Working on one task and then getting easily sidetracked onto another task. So an individual might report this. You could ask them, are you able to sustain attention? Can you finish things that you start? And the individual might report, no, I used to be pretty good at starting tasks at work, but now I feel like I've got 10, half-started tasks, but I haven't finished anything this week. So that would be indicative that they are more distracted than they used to be. Or it might actually be observable. You might be able to watch an individual start tasks and then not complete them. It might be evident in their speech and trying to keep them on topic during an interview, or you might be getting observations from family members or coworkers or other people that an individual is engaging with. So all of these cognitive symptoms are indicative that a person's thought patterns have shifted in the context of this elevated or expansive mood. And then finally, we have the somatic symptoms, so the way that a person is physiologically experiencing this elevated mood. One of the key characteristics of a manic or a hypomanic episode is a decreased need for sleep. So unlike insomnia, where a person is unable to sleep and finds this distressing and may feel fatigued or tired as a result of a loss of sleep, often during a manic or a hypomanic episode, an individual is going to be sleeping less than their typical amount of sleep while feeling rested and having a normal or even excessive amount of energy. So someone might come in and say, I've been sleeping 3 or 4 hours a night, but I feel really great. I don't need that much sleep anymore. Sometimes this can be one of the early signs of onset of a manic or a hypomanic episode. So if you have an individual with bipolar disorder that you're treating as a clinician, you're often monitoring their sleep. And if you notice that they have a decreased need for sleep, that they're starting to report that they're sleeping a little bit less at night, but still feeling like they have a really good energy level, this can be a sign that they may be experiencing the onset of an episode of mania or hypomania, and that's a sign for concern. So anytime that somebody comes in and reports, I'm not sleeping a lot, I'm only sleeping a couple hours a night, but I'm feeling really good, that's a really strong indicator that you want to screen for these other symptoms of mania or hypomania, because it can be a really key symptom that can clue you in that you're seeing an episode of mania or hypomania. And it can also be one of those earliest signs that can tell you that you need to keep an eye out for these other symptoms. And then our next somatic symptom is that psychomotor agitation. So similar to what we saw with the depressive disorders, this behavioral activation, a lot of physical energy that's not necessarily directed at goal-directed behavior or increased behavior, but just nervous energy that's visible somatically. So you might see someone pacing, they might be unable to sit still, they might be going for very long walks to get rid of this nervous energy. So the individual's energy level is so high that they are unable to manage that energy without a lot of physical motion. So this final set of symptoms are these physical changes that are characteristic of manic and hypomanic states. So to distinguish between mania and hypomania, we're going to consider a few different elements. So first we'll define a manic episode. So to diagnose someone as having an episode of mania, the person needs to exhibit at least 3 or more of the symptoms that we discussed, in addition to that key mood symptom of elevated, expansive, or irritable mood. If the mood is irritable and not elevated or euphoric or expansive, they need 4 additional symptoms. So if they have a euphoric or expansive mood, they only need 3 of those additional symptoms from the behavioral, cognitive, and somatic symptoms that we discussed. If they have an expansive, irritable mood, they need 4 of those additional symptoms. In addition to having these symptoms, the symptoms need to be present for at least 1 week, with one important caveat. If the symptoms are severe enough that the individual needs to be hospitalized, the duration does not need to last the full week. So if your symptoms are severe enough that you need to be hospitalized, that automatically qualifies an individual for a manic episode. But in the absence of hospitalization, the symptoms need to be present for at least 7 days. During that period, the symptoms need to be present most of the day, nearly every day. So similar to with our major depressive episode, these are not transient symptoms, these are not reactive symptoms. This is a persistent elevated mood state. And another important characteristic of mania is that the symptoms cause marked impairment or in social or occupational functioning, require hospitalization, or have psychotic features. So these are severe symptoms. They are either causing problems in functioning, so they might be causing problems in a person's relationships. Maybe they're engaging in a lot of sexual activity outside of their relationship. Maybe they have quit their job and moved across the country. Maybe they are running up credit card bills and spending money that they don't have. Maybe they are quitting projects at work to start on new projects and causing problems with their boss. So not only is the change in their behavior noticeable to others, but it's noticeable to the point that it causes impairment. Often during a manic episode, the individual themselves will not have insight into the loss of functioning that they are experiencing. So because they are experiencing this elevated mood, elevated energy, increased self-concept, they may feel that things are going very well. So sometimes you're getting this information from friends or family members or coworkers, or sometimes a person is reporting this retrospectively, that when they come out of the manic episode, that they're able to report and say, I thought I felt really good while I was experiencing the symptoms, but then when I stopped being manic, there were a lot of messes in my life that I needed to clean up that I had caused by my behavior during the manic episode. So impairment in functioning, hospitalization, or psychotic features. So hospitalization and psychotic features are both severe enough to automatically lead to a diagnosis of a manic episode. And similar to our depressive disorders, these psychotic features, the thing that distinguishes them from primary psychotic disorders is that we're only seeing the psychotic features in the context of the mood episode. So during a severe manic episode, a person might experience delusions or hallucinations. They might have delusions of grandeur, that their self-concept is so inflated that they start having delusional beliefs. They might be experiencing hallucinations. They might see things that aren't there or hear things that aren't there. But importantly, for a manic episode, you're only seeing these psychotic features during this elevated mood state. And when the manic episode resolves, the psychotic symptoms also resolve. So if you're seeing psychotic features that persist after the mood episode ends, that suggests that another diagnosis might be more appropriate, for example, something like a schizoaffective disorder. And just like with our depressive disorders, another clue that psychotic symptoms might be a characteristic of a manic episode rather than a psychotic disorder is whether those symptoms are mood congruent. So if someone's delusional beliefs or hallucinations are consistent with other episodes of their mania, so for example, believing that they are psychic, believing that they have special powers, that's another clue that you might be seeing psychotic symptoms of a manic episode as opposed to psychotic symptoms coming from a primary psychotic disorder. So those are the defining characteristics of mania. The diagnostic criteria for a hypomanic episode, you'll notice, are pretty similar. And the first one is actually identical. So the individual needs to display at least 3 or more symptoms in addition to that elevated, expansive, euphoric, or irritable mood. If their elevated mood state is irritable, they need to have 4 of those additional symptoms. The duration criteria for a hypomanic episode is different. So these symptoms need to be present for at least 4 days. Again, the symptoms need to be present most of the day, nearly every day over that 4-day period, so they're still persistent elevated mood states. And the symptoms are associated with a change in function, so they are uncharacteristic of the individual, but they are not severe enough to cause impairment in functioning, they're not severe enough to require hospitalization, and there's no evidence for psychotic symptoms like delusions or hallucinations. So we can see 2 key differences here between episodes of mania and episodes of hypomania. So the first is duration. So the requirement for length for hypomania is shorter than for mania. You can receive a diagnosis of a hypomanic episode in 4 days. To meet criteria for a full manic episode, symptoms need to be present for at least a week unless the individual is hospitalized. And the other major difference between mania and hypomania is the severity of the symptoms. So manic episodes are severe and cause impairments in functioning. Hypomanic episodes are less severe, they are noticeable, the change in a person's mood state and other behaviors are observable to other people, but they're not necessarily associated with a decrease in functioning. And in fact, most individuals during a hypomanic episode report that their functioning is actually enhanced. They are socializing more, they're enjoying their social life, they may be more productive at work, they may be more productive at school, they really may be able to function generally at a higher level. And hypomanic episodes are generally very ego-syntonic, so people enjoy hypomanic mood states. The expansive mood, the increased energy, the enhanced self-esteem, all of these symptoms are generally pleasant to experience, and because hypomanic episodes don't cause problems in functioning, hypomanic episodes themselves can be very ego-syntonic. Manic episodes, in contrast, are often egosyntonic while the individual is in the manic episode, but individuals often experience a lot of distress after the manic episode ends as a result of behaviors that they've engaged in or problems that they've experienced as a result of their manic episodes. So the key features that distinguish episodes of mania and hypomania from one another are not the symptoms, so they're the exact same symptom, the exact same number of symptoms required, but they're distinguished by the duration of the symptoms, the severity of the symptoms, and the associated level of functional impairment. And remember that this is important for distinguishing among our various disorders that are included in the category of bipolar disorders. So all of these disorders are characterized by disturbances in mood that are elevated relative to a euthymic mood state, and may also include depressed mood, but don't necessarily have to, depending on the disorder. So for bipolar 1 disorder, an individual is only required to have met criteria for one full episode of mania. An episode of depression is not required, although many individuals with bipolar disorder type 1 do also have a history of major depressive episodes. Bipolar 2 disorder, in contrast, a person needs to have a history of at least one episode of hypomania and at least one full episode of major depressive disorder. And then cyclothymia is characterized by persistent low-grade mood symptoms that are both elevated and depressed. So 2 or more years of subthreshold symptoms of hypomania and depressive symptoms where they're not meeting full criteria for hypomanic episodes or major depressive episodes.